The laughter started the moment my brother saw the envelope. It wasn't the polite kind of laughter people use to hide discomfort. It was the loud, confident kind, the kind someone makes when they're absolutely sure they're about to win. My brother brought an envelope, Richard Hale said, holding it up between two fingers like it was something mildly embarrassing. Around the long conference table, the family attorneys and trustees exchanged amused looks. My name is Adrian Hale, and that morning we were gathered for the final reading of my grandfather's estate. A man who had built one of the largest logistics companies in the country, and a man who had one final condition for his heirs. Richard leaned back in his chair, smirking. "You know the rules, right?" he said. I nodded. Grandfather's will had been simple. Each family member had to present something meaningful, something that proved they understood what he valued most. Not money, not status, but judgment. Richard gestured proudly toward the polished wooden box sitting beside him. "Mine's a vintage Patek Philippe watch," he announced. A few people nodded in approval. "Cost me $180,000. The trustee raised an eyebrow. "Very impressive." Richard turned toward me again. "So what did you bring, Adrian?" He lifted the envelope again and shook it lightly. The room chuckled. One of the lawyers leaned toward another and whispered something about sentimental gestures. Richard smiled wider. "You couldn't even buy a proper gift." I didn't answer. Instead, I looked toward Mr. Caldwell, the elderly trustee who had worked with my grandfather for over 40 years. "Would you like to open it?" I asked. Richard laughed. "Oh, please do." Mr. Caldwell adjusted his glasses and slowly took the envelope. The room quieted slightly. He opened it carefully and pulled out a single sheet of paper. For a moment, his expression didn't change. Then his eyebrows rose. Richard leaned forward. "What is it?" Mr. Caldwell read the page again. Then he looked up at me. "Adrian, where did you get this?" Richard rolled his eyes. "It's probably a thank you letter or something." Mr. Caldwell turned the paper around. "This," he said quietly, "is the purchase agreement for Hale Freight Logistics." The room went silent. Richard blinked. "What?" Mr. Caldwell placed the document on the table. "The company your grandfather built." Richard laughed once. "It's impossible." I leaned back in my chair. "Not impossible." Richard stared at the paper again. "You're telling me?" His voice cracked slightly. "You bought grandfather's company?" I nodded calmly.
"Last week."
The room was completely silent now, because the cheap envelope my brother had been mocking contained something worth far more than a $180,000 watch. For several seconds, nobody at the table moved. The purchase agreement sat in the middle of the polished wood like a bomb that had just been placed there. Richard Hale leaned forward slowly, staring at the document as if it might suddenly turn into something else. "That's not real," he said. Mr. Caldwell adjusted his glasses again and carefully lifted the paper. "I'm afraid it is," the trustee replied. Richard looked at me. "You don't have that kind of money," I shrugged. "Slightly, I didn't say I paid cash." One of the family lawyers leaned closer. "May I see that?" Mr. Caldwell handed him the document. The lawyer scanned the first page, then the second. His expression changed. "This is a controlling acquisition," he said quietly. Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" The lawyer placed the agreement back. "On the table, it means Adrian didn't just invest in Hale Freight Logistics." He glanced toward me. "He now owns it." The words echoed through the room. My brother leaned back in his chair, like someone had just punched the air out of him. "That company is worth over $900 million, he said. "Yes," I replied. "And you expect us to believe you bought it last week?" "Yes." Richard laughed nervously. "This is ridiculous." He pointed at the contract. "Grandfather owned the majority shares." Mr. Caldwell nodded. "He did." Richard folded his arms. "So how exactly did Adrian buy the company if grandfather was still alive?" The trustee looked at me for a moment. Before answering, "Because your grandfather approved the sale, personally," the room went quiet again. Richard blinked. "What?" Mr. Caldwell continued calmly. 6 days ago, your grandfather authorized a private share transfer." My aunt gasped softly. "You mean he sold the company before he passed away?" "Yes." Richard turned toward me slowly. "You're lying." I shook my head. "Grandfather asked me to make an offer." The trustee nodded again. "That is correct." Richard looked completely lost now. But why would he sell the company to you? I leaned forward slightly. Because I was the only person who offered him something he wanted. What? I glanced at the watch box still sitting proudly beside. Richard, continuity. The trustee spoke quietly. Your grandfather didn't want Halley Freight Logistics to become another family inheritance dispute. The lawyer added something else. The purchase agreement includes a clause guaranteeing the company will remain privately operated for the next 20 years. Richard stared at the document again. You promise that? Yes, Mr. Caldwell. Folded his hands on the table. Your grandfather believed the company needed someone who would protect it. Richard's voice grew sharper, and he thought that person was you. I met his eyes calmly. No, the room leaned closer. He thought it was the person who understood the company better than anyone else. Richard frowned. And who is that? I leaned back in my chair again. Then I said the words that made the entire room fall silent. The man who's been running it for the past 3 years? Richard blinked. What are you talking about? I smiled slightly. While you were busy buying expensive watches, was building the company your gift was meant to impress. Richard stared at me like he had never seen me before. That's impossible, he said. But the confidence he had earlier was gone. I glanced at the document still sitting on the table between us 3 years ago. I said calmly, Grandfather stopped coming to the office. Mr. Caldwell nodded. That's true. Richard frowned. He was retired. Not exactly. The trustee looked toward the rest of the family. Your grandfather stepped away publicly, Mr. Caldwell explained, but the company still needed someone managing daily operations. Richard crossed his arms. So he hired someone. I shook my head. No, my brother's eyes narrowed. Then who was running it? I picked up the purchase agreement and slid it back toward the center of the table. Me. The silence returned. Richard laughed once, but it sounded forced. You expect us to believe you've been running a $900 million logistics company? Yes. Mr. Caldwell spoke quietly. That is correct. Richard turned sharply toward him. You knew about this? Yes. The trustee folded his hands. Your grandfather asked Adrian to step in 3 years ago. My aunt blinked in confusion. But why didn't anyone tell us? Mr. Caldwell gave a small smile. Because your grandfather wanted to see how everyone behaved when they believed Adrian had no power. Richard looked like someone had just drained all the color from his face. So while we were joking about him, I nodded. I was managing the company's expansion. Richard shook his head slowly. This is insane. The lawyer sitting beside him cleared his throat. It explained something. Richard looked at him. What? The company's revenue. Everyone turned toward the lawyer. Hale Freight Logistics increased its annual profit by 47% over the last 3 years. My father leaned forward suddenly. That was Adrian. The lawyer nodded. Double quotes. Yes. Richard rubbed his forehead. You're telling me the reason the company grew so fast? He pointed at me. Was him? Mr. Caldwell answered calmly. Yes. Richard looked back at the watch box sitting beside him, the expensive gift that had seemed so impressive earlier. Now, it looked very small. You planned this, he muttered. I shook my head. No. Then what was the point of all this? I leaned forward slightly. The point was to see what everyone valued. Richard frowned. And what does that mean? I gestured toward the watch box again. You brought a $180,000 watch. Richard didn't answer. I tapped the purchase agreement. I brought the company. The room stayed silent, because suddenly everyone understood something my grandfather had known all along. The real test in the will had never been about the gifts. The room remained silent long after the realization settled in. Richard stared at the watch box beside him. The same gift he had proudly displayed earlier. Just an hour ago, it had seemed impressive. Something expensive enough to prove he understood value. Now it looked small. Mr. Caldwell gently folded the purchase agreement and placed it back into the envelope. Your grandfather believed wealth reveals character. The trustee said calmly. No one interrupted him. That's why he created this final condition in the will. Richard frowned. What condition? The trustee looked around the table. He wanted to see what each of you would bring when you believed the company was already gone. My aunt blinked. You mean this wasn't about impressing him with expensive gifts? Mr. Caldwell shook his head. No. Then he pointed toward me. Adrian understood that. Richard leaned forward suddenly. So what happens now? The trustee opened a second folder in front of him. Inside were the final pages of my grandfather's will. Now, Mr. Caldwell said. We read the final instruction. The lawyers leaned closer. My father sat back slowly, and Richard looked like he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Mr. Caldwell adjusted his glasses and began reading too. My grandchildren. His voice filled the quiet room. The future of Hale Freight Logistics belongs to the one who understands that a company is not a trophy, but a responsibility. Richard looked toward me again. For 3 years, Adrian Hale has protected the company without recognition, without title, and without complaint. The trustee paused briefly, then continued. Because of that, he will now receive full operational authority of the Hale Freight Group and its controlling shares. A soft gasp escaped from the far end of the table. Richard's voice came out. Barely above a whisper, you mean? Mr. Caldwell closed the will slowly. Yes. The answer was simple. The company now belongs to Adrian. Richard sat back in his chair, stunned. 3 years earlier, he'd been certain the family business would one day be his. Now the truth had landed in front of him like the envelope he had laughed at earlier. The watch box remained untouched. I stood up from my chair. My father looked at me carefully. So what will you do now? I slipped the envelope back into my jacket. The same thing I've been doing for the past 3 years. Richard frowned. What's that? I walked toward the door, running the company, and I paused briefly and looked back at the table. Just without the jokes this time. For the first time that morning, no one was laughing.